I didn't ruin my life in a dramatic way. There was no scandal. No collapse. No single reckless decision that everything can be traced back to. If you look at my life from the outside, it appears orderly, reasonable, even successful. The kind of life people point to when they say, that's how you're supposed to do it. That's the part that makes this hard to explain. I followed the rules. I listened when people told me what made sense. I chose stability over impulse, responsibility over desire, long-term plans over temporary feelings. Every decision was defendable. Every step had logic behind it. And yet, somewhere along the way, I stopped being the one who was living. At first, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like maturity. Like growing up. You learn to compromise. You learn to wait. You learn that not every feeling deserves action. That life is about timing, not impulse. So I waited. I waited for the right moment to change direction. For the right conditions to pursue what I wanted. For the right version of myself, calmer, wiser, more prepared to arrive. That version never came. Each time I postponed something that mattered to me, I told myself it was temporary. That I was being smart. That I would circle back once things were more stable, once obligations were lighter, once I had earned the right to choose freely. What I didn't see was that stability kept expanding to fill the space where my life should have been. I became very good at explaining my choices. I could justify them to anyone. To family. To friends. To myself. Every path I didn't take had a reason. Every door I closed had logic behind it. Logic is a powerful sedative. It keeps you calm while something essential slips away. I noticed the shift in small ways first. I stopped feeling excited about the future. Not pessimistic, just neutral. Plans felt like checklists rather than possibilities. I achieved things I had once wanted, only to feel strangely untouched by them. People congratulated me. I thanked them sincerely. I wasn't lying when I said I was fine. I just wasn't present. There was a quiet voice that occasionally surfaced, usually late at night, or in moments when I wasn't distracted. It asked questions I didn't want to answer. Is this really your life? Is this what you wanted, or just what you accepted? I learned how to silence that voice efficiently. I told myself it was childish. Ungrateful. That plenty of people would be happy to have what I had. That wanting something else meant not appreciating what was already there. So I doubled down on being reasonable. I stayed where I was needed. I fulfilled expectations. I made choices that didn't surprise anyone. I became dependable in a way that slowly replaced being alive. Dependability is praised because it makes other people comfortable. No one warns you what it costs. Years passed like this quietly, without friction. I aged in increments rather than moments. Birthdays stopped feeling like markers and started feeling like reminders. Each year confirmed that the life I was living had momentum of its own, and I was no longer steering it. I told myself that discomfort was just restlessness. That everyone feels this way sometimes. That adulthood is about accepting limits. But this wasn't about limits. It was about absence. One evening, I caught myself looking at someone else's life with an intensity that surprised me. Not envy, not exactly. Something heavier. They had made a choice that didn't make sense to anyone else, and they were living with the consequences openly. I wasn't jealous of their outcome. I was jealous of their authorship. That realization unsettled me. I saw, suddenly, how much of my life had been written in response to expectations rather than desire. How often I had asked what should I do instead of what do I want, and how easily should had replaced want altogether. The mental shift wasn't dramatic. It was slow and uncomfortable, like realizing you've been speaking a language for years that isn't actually yours. Everything functions, but nothing resonates. I began to understand that I hadn't made one wrong decision. I had made hundreds of small, sensible ones, all pointing slightly away from myself. The breakdown didn't arrive as tears or panic. It arrived as clarity that refused to leave. Once I saw the pattern, I couldn't unsee it. Every memory reorganized itself around that truth. I had been choosing correctness over connection, safety over sincerity, approval over alignment. And now, the cost was visible. I had built a life that worked but didn't respond to me. That night, sitting alone, I tried to imagine the rest of my life continuing exactly as it was. No catastrophe. No dramatic change. Just more of the same. The thought filled me with a quiet dread I couldn't rationalize away. It wasn't fear of failure. It was fear of completion. Of reaching the end having done everything right and never having truly lived as myself. That was the moment I understood something that no one prepares you for: you don't need to destroy your life to lose it. Sometimes, you just follow the rules long enough that there's nothing left to choose. Once I admitted the truth to myself, I expected urgency to follow. Panic. A rush to fix things before it was too late. That's how regret is usually portrayed: loud, desperate, full of dramatic gestures. What I felt instead was paralysis. Knowing that my life wasn't truly mine didn't immediately give me the power to change it. It did the opposite. It made every possible move feel dangerously significant. When you realize you've been living a borrowed life, even small choices start to feel like betrayals of expectations, of history, of the version of you everyone else believes in. I didn't know where to begin. I tried to reconnect with myself in harmless ways. Reading things I used to love. Revisiting old interests. Taking walks without purpose. These gestures looked like self-care from the outside, but inside they felt artificial, almost embarrassing. Nothing responded. It was as if the part of me that knew how to want had been dormant for so long that it no longer recognized my voice. I could remember what I used to care about, but memory isn't desire. It's just proof that something once existed. That realization was brutal. I had assumed that if I ever gave myself permission, everything I had postponed would rush back. Passion. Curiosity. Direction. Instead, I was faced with a blank interior, not because I was broken, but because I had never practiced listening to myself without translating it into something reasonable. I noticed how often my thoughts still defaulted to justification. Even alone, even in private, I caught myself explaining my feelings as if someone were watching. As if my inner life still needed approval to be valid. That was when I understood how deep the conditioning went. I hadn't just lived a correct life. I had internalized correctness as a moral framework. Wanting something that disrupted it felt wrong in a way that went beyond fear. It felt unethical. Selfish. Immature. Those words echoed loudly. I started to feel anger then. Not explosive anger, the kind that would have been easier to handle, but a slow, bitter resentment. Toward myself, mostly. For being so compliant. For mistaking safety for virtue. For believing that avoiding mistakes was the same as living well. That anger had nowhere to go. I couldn't blame anyone else. No one had forced me. No one had explicitly stopped me from choosing differently. The life I was living was the result of my own consistent, reasonable decisions. That made the regret heavier. I began to see how trapped I was by my own reputation. People saw me as stable, dependable, sensible. Someone who didn't do impulsive things. Someone who could be trusted not to disrupt the order of things. Changing now wouldn't just affect me. It would confuse people. Disappoint them. Possibly worry them. The thought of becoming unrecognizable felt cruel, even though the recognition itself was part of the problem. I had built relationships on predictability. Predictability is comfortable until it becomes a cage. I imagined what it would mean to choose differently. To say no where I had always said yes. To leave things that made sense. to pursue something without a guarantee of success or understanding. Every scenario ended the same way, with me standing alone inside a choice no one could validate for me. That loneliness terrified me. I realized then that my greatest fear wasn't failure. It was isolation. The idea of being the only one who understood why I had chosen this path and having to live with that understanding without reassurance. For years, I had outsourced my sense of meaning to consensus. If enough people agreed a choice was right, I felt safe inside it. Taking that away felt like stepping into open space without a harness. I tried to talk myself out of it. I reminded myself of responsibilities, of time already invested, of the risks of starting over later in life. I told myself that reinvention is a fantasy sold to people who don't understand consequences. All of that was true. And still, it wasn't enough. Because beneath every rational argument was the same quiet fact: continuing as I was would be easier and emptier. It would preserve everything except my sense of authorship. I would move forward, accumulate milestones, and slowly disappear inside achievements that never felt chosen. The thought of that future scared me more than change ever had. I felt caught between two losses. The loss of stability if I chose myself, and the loss of self if I didn't. One was visible, measurable, easy to explain. The other was invisible, internal, and impossible to justify. I had been trained to choose the loss I could explain. Now, that training felt like a betrayal. The breakdown came quietly, one evening when I realized I was no longer planning a future, I was extending a pattern. There was no image of who I was becoming, only a continuation of who I had already been. That's when I understood something painful and clarifying: there was no way to add myself back into this life. The version of me I was missing hadn't been misplaced. It had been excluded by design. Every compromise, every delay, every reasonable decision had reinforced a structure that no longer had space for me as I actually was. If I wanted to live as myself, something would have to end. Not explode. Not collapse. End. And endings, even quiet ones, are irreversible. That knowledge sat with me for a long time. I didn't act on it immediately. I carried it through ordinary days, through conversations that suddenly felt scripted, through routines that now felt like reenactments rather than participation. The world hadn't changed. I had. And once you see that you are living someone else's idea of a good life, the most painful part isn't regret. It's knowing that whatever comes next will cost you the version of yourself everyone else understands. The decision didn't arrive as a moment of courage. It arrived as exhaustion. Not the kind that sleep fixes, but the kind that comes from holding the same position for too long, from pretending alignment where there is none. I reached a point where maintaining the life I had built required more energy than letting it go. That's when I understood something simple and unsettling: I wasn't afraid of change anymore. I was tired of self-betrayal. There was no dramatic announcement. No confession to the people around me. I didn't gather anyone and explain my inner crisis. That would have turned my choice into a performance, and I was done performing. Instead, I made a series of quiet decisions that, taken individually, looked harmless. I stopped committing to long-term plans that assumed the same future. I declined opportunities that locked me further into the identity I was already shedding. I allowed uncertainty to exist without rushing to neutralize it. Each small choice felt wrong at first. Not morally wrong, socially wrong. As if I were violating an unspoken agreement to remain consistent, understandable, reasonable. I felt the absence of approval immediately. Conversations changed tone. Questions appeared. People tried to help by offering advice that would steer me back toward the familiar path. I thanked them. And didn't follow it? The hardest part was living without a clear narrative. I wasn't becoming something impressive. I wasn't chasing a dream that made sense on paper. I was simply refusing to continue a life that didn't respond to me. There is no applause for that. There were moments when doubt nearly pulled me back. Nights when the comfort of the old life felt close enough to touch. I could have returned easily. The door was still open. All it required was agreement, a willingness to say, "This is fine." But I knew that sentence too well. Saying it again would have sealed something permanently. So I let the door close. What followed wasn't freedom. It was grief. Grief for the years I had lived correctly instead of honestly. Grief for the version of myself that never got the chance to exist because it didn't fit the plan. Grief for the fact that doing everything right doesn't protect you from loss, it just makes the loss harder to explain. I didn't rush through that grief. I couldn't. It demanded to be felt slowly, without justification. There was no one to blame. No injustice to rage against. Just the quiet recognition that I had traded authorship for approval, and now had to live with the cost. But inside that grief was something else. Relief. Not relief that things were better, they weren't, not yet, but relief that I was no longer lying to myself. That my days, however uncertain, were no longer rehearsals for a life I didn't want. I began to notice how different the weight of choice felt when it was actually mine. Heavier, yes. Lonelier. But also cleaner. There was no committee in my head anymore, no imaginary audience evaluating my decisions. Just consequence. I learned to tolerate that. I won't pretend this led to immediate happiness. It didn't. Some days felt smaller, quieter, less significant than before. I had fewer markers of success. Fewer external confirmations that I was doing well. But I had something I had been missing for years. Responsiveness. When something interested me, I felt it. When something drained me, I noticed. When I made a mistake, it was mine, not a deviation from a script, but a real misstep in a life I was actively shaping. That mattered more than comfort. The final realization came gradually, as most important truths do. I saw how easy it is to lose your life without ever losing control. How obedience, patience, and reason can become tools of erasure when they replace desire entirely. No one warns you about that version of failure. If you're listening to this because your life looks right but feels distant because you've done everything you were supposed to do and still feel like a guest in your own existence, understand this: a correct life is not the same as a lived one. You can follow every rule and still abandon yourself. You can avoid every obvious mistake and still miss your own life quietly, efficiently, without scandal. I didn't destroy my life to find myself. I stopped continuing one that wasn't mine. That choice didn't make me brave. It made me responsible in a way I had never been before, responsible not for meeting expectations, but for inhabiting my own existence. I don't know exactly where this path leads. It doesn't come with guarantees or validation. But when I wake up now, I feel something I hadn't felt in years. Presence. And presence, I've learned, is the one thing you can't borrow, delay, or earn later. You either choose it, or you live without it. I did everything right. And almost lost my entire life. This is me choosing not to lose what's left.